Did the Trump administration accidentally text war plans to a major journalist? That's the subject of an Atlantic story that dropped on Monday, and it had everybody here in Washington, D.C. talking. This is the headline. It says, quote, "The Trump administration accidentally texted me its war plans." You could probably guess the byline on this story if you follow the Atlantic's foreign policy coverage closely. It is the one and only Jeffrey Goldberg, of course. And Jeffrey Goldberg is seen in Trump circles as a major opposition figure. He's obviously editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Now, he reported the infamous, quote, "suckers and losers" story, alleging that Donald Trump refused to visit a cemetery. This was back in 2018 in France, because he believed that dead soldiers were, quote, "suckers and losers." People who are alleged to have been around it at the time have denied it. It appears that Goldberg's source has since come out as then it was John Kelly. Then, in Trump circles was John Kelly. But later, everyone sort of saw John Kelly as a figure who turned against Donald Trump. So anyway, all of that is to say Jeffrey Goldberg is not the type of person that you would just like accidentally include, or you would intentionally include, I should say, on this chain. So here's what happened. This is how Goldberg summarizes it in the subheading of the piece. Quote, "U.S. national security leaders included me in a group chat about upcoming military strikes in Yemen. I didn't think it could be real. Then the bombs started falling." Okay, so this is about Goldberg. On March 11th, he, quote, says, "I received a connection request on Signal from a user identified as Michael Waltz." That's Trump's national security advisor. Signal is an open source encrypted messaging service, blah, blah, blah. He goes on to explain what Signal is and says, "I assumed that the Michael Waltz in question was President Donald Trump's national security advisor. I did not assume, however, that the request was from the actual Michael Waltz." That's probably just journalistically a good assumption in this case. It seems pretty obvious, as Goldberg says, that could be easily someone messing with him and trying to run an influence operation, catch a journalist in a bad position by communicating back and forth with the actual national security advisor on Signal. And we'll get into why Signal is itself problematic in all of this. But as time goes on, it appears more and more to Goldberg that this is absolutely a real back and forth, not a collection of people being spoofed by different numbers. So you have Marco Rubio, when he's asked in this thread to provide someone who should be basically like your principal for coordination. Marco Rubio says Mike Needham for state. Mike Needham is his like deputy at the State Department. He's like his number 2 at the State Department, and has been with him for a long time. Then there's a Signal user named JD Vance, who jumps in and names his own principal. Then TG, who Goldberg speculates is Tulsi Gabbard, writes Joe Kent for DNI. TG, talking about DNI, obviously sounds like it's Tulsi Gabbard. Then you get Scott B. Then you get Pete Hegseth. Then you get John Ratcliffe. It's just unbelievable to go down the list. And the most unbelievable thing in all of this is the screenshots, which I obviously can't describe over audio, but if you're watching this, you absolutely have to see them. We're talking cabinet level people having these like pretty fascinating back and forths. This isn't just like, sometimes you accidentally get a press release that wasn't supposed to go to you or an email that wasn't supposed to go to you. This is like substantive and interesting back and forth between JD Vance and Pete Hegseth on the Houthi strikes. So JD Vance at one point says, and this is really interesting, he says about the president, he actually invokes the president and says, "I'm not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now. There's a further risk that we see a moderate to severe spike in oil prices. I'm willing to support the consensus of the team and keep these concerns to myself, but there's a strong argument for delaying this a month, doing the messaging work on why this matters, seeing where the economy is, etc." Then Joe Kent and John Ratcliffe talk about this as well. Some of it is so sensitive that Goldberg doesn't reveal what it is. That's been controversial with people like Ken Klippenstein, who's been on this show a couple of times. Pete Hegseth says, "VP, I understand your concerns and fully support you raising with POTUS important considerations, most of which are tough to know how they play out. economy, Ukraine peace, Gaza, etc. I think messaging is going to be tough no matter what. Nobody knows who the Houthis are, which is why we need to stay focused on one, Biden failed, and two, Iran funded. And Hegseth has a pretty, again, this is a substantive back and forth with JD Vance, who then says to @Pete Hegseth, if you think we should do it, let's go. I just hate bailing Europe out again. Hegseth comes back, VP, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's all caps pathetic. But Mike is correct. We're the only ones on the planet who can do this. Okay, so you sort of get the gist that as this is coming through on Goldberg's Signal app, it's increasingly looking very real and it's increasingly looking very interesting. So, Goldberg says, the next morning this becomes, quote, truly bizarre. I mean, I think it's already pretty much bizarre. But he says he starts to get, there's a all caps team update from Pete Hegseth at 11:44 a.m. And Goldberg says, I will not quote from this update or from certain other subsequent texts. The information contained in them, if they had been read by an adversary of the U.S., could conceivably have been used to harm American military and intel personnel. But he says, what I will say in order to illustrate the shocking recklessness of the Signal conversation is that the Hegseth post contained operational details of forthcoming strikes on Yemen. And Goldberg says he's waiting in a supermarket parking lot and realize, one of the things that made him absolutely certain this was real is the strikes that were being discussed in the Signal chat actually happened. He says, if the Signal chat was real, I reason Houthi targets would soon be bombed. At about 1:55, I checked X and searched Yemen. Explosions were then being heard across Sana'a, the capital city. So Goldberg leaves the Signal message, which, I have a lot of thoughts and we'll get into all of that after just covering the nature of the story. He leaves the Signal message and sends a comment request to basically people involved. And it turns out exactly what you would expect when you have this detailed level, conversation playing out. Was at that point unlikely to be a simulation. And so they say to him that they are looking into this. This is from Brian Hughes, a spokesman for the NSC, the National Security Council. He says, this appears to be an authentic message chain, and we are reviewing how an inadvertent number was added to the chain. The thread is a demonstration of the deep and thoughtful policy coordination between senior officials. That is some great top-level spin, by the way. This guy should get a raise. The ongoing success of the Houthi operation demonstrates that there were no threats to troops or national security. So there's just so much going on here. A lot of people who are looking at this, and maybe you say you've never seen anything like that. I'm always hesitant to say that I've never seen anything like this because it's just been the most bizarre 10 years in American politics. I can't really think of anything like this except for the Hillary Clinton emails, but those were leaked in a phishing hack, essentially. And this leak is apparently due to an accident, adding a journalist, and a very high-level journalist, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, a high-level opponent of the administration, to the chat. So first of all, they are very, very lucky that this was Jeffrey Goldberg, somebody who is generally favorable to the Pentagon, and even though he's oppositional to the Trump administration, is very well-sourced in Pentagon circles, and is not the type of person who would betray the secrets that were revealed, or that would be, in his mind, they would be damaging to national security. As I mentioned earlier, people like Ken Klippenstein disagree with that and think it's rather cowardly of Goldberg not to publish the contents of the messages. But we really have no idea what they were. But the administration is so lucky that even though this was one of the most oppositional journalists you could possibly bring into a conversation like that, that it was Jeffrey Goldberg, who ultimately is very loyal to the quote-unquote deep state. That's actually one of the arguments against Jeffrey Goldberg from Trump circles. So in this case, it really worked out well for them. But on the other hand, this is going to be a crisis for Michael Waltz, and NSA Michael Waltz, who is accused by Goldberg of putting this group together. It's very possible that Waltz was looking for another person with the initials JG, because actually what Goldberg says in the story is he appeared on his own screen only as JG. So if that's his Signal user ID. It's possible that Waltz was going into his phone and was trying to add, I mean, one theory that I have that I've seen a couple of analysts agree with is that he was trying to add the United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer, because strikes on the Houthis are hugely trade is hugely salient to strikes on the Houthis. It's one of the things J.D. Vance is talking about. And so maybe he just had JG in his contacts, Michael Waltz, and knew that he had JG in his contacts and just associated that with Jameson Greer. And that's how Goldberg ended up getting added to the message. I actually have no idea whether or not that's true. I think it is incredibly unlikely that this was intentional, because Goldberg says that it was Waltz who added him to this, and in a signal message you can see who's in the group. So everyone would have had to have been sort of complicit in wanting this JG in the group, or at least not bothering to figure out who this JG is in the group, who hasn't said anything. So I mean, Susie Wiles is in this message. Scott Besant, I mentioned that earlier. Steve Witkoff. There are all kinds of people in here. So it would be weird to add someone named JG intentionally without coordinating with them, right? He could have blown it up at any moment. Jeffrey Goldberg could have blown it up at any moment if it was intentional and wasn't coordinated, hypothetically, with him ahead of time. Like, that explanation just doesn't make sense. What seems to have happened here is that the National Security Advisor, who is in charge of national security, and has been critical of Democrats who have been insufficiently protective of data like this. So actually, I have a post here from Mike Waltz, 2023. Biden sitting National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan sent top secret messages to Hillary Clinton's private account. And what did the DOJ do about it? Not a damn thing. That's from June 12th of 2023. So there are all kinds of ethical and legal questions about Signal in particular, some of which Goldberg raises in here. He says that these messages were set to auto-delete, and that can start running afoul. There are other government employees who've gotten in trouble for using Signal in this way, because there are records. We got into all of this with one of the big cases against Donald Trump. There are laws about what you can do when it comes to deleting records, government records. You really have to be careful doing government business over things like Signal, which again can auto-delete, can be set to auto-delete. As Goldberg puts here, Waltz set some of the messages in the Signal group to disappear after 1 week and some after 4. That raises questions about whether the officials may have violated federal records law. Text messages about official acts are considered records that should be preserved legally. Now, there's also questions, to return to Michael Waltz's own point about Hillary Clinton, when it comes to classified information. So Waltz seems to have made an insane accident in adding the wrong JG to this chat, or the wrong person in general to this chat, not checking it, just being sort of careless here with highly, highly classified information. I mean, this appears to have been, if there's somebody in here who gets a hold of Jeffrey Goldberg's phone, because he's a journalist and somebody's already hacked his phone, or he leaves it somewhere and someone gets into it, whatever, and they want to hurt the United States, as unlikely of a scenario as that seems, there's potential, obviously, for that to have potentially have happened. And as Goldberg points out in the story, the Signal app is not, quote, approved by the government for sharing classified information. The government has its own systems for that purpose. If officials want to discuss military activity, they should go into a SCIF. This is Goldberg's perspective, and says, had they lost their phones, and this applies to everybody who's on Signal having this conversation, or had they been stolen, the potential risk to national security would have been severe. The same goes for if their signals were hacked, something to that extent. People use Signal a lot here in DC. It's encrypted. iMessage is also encrypted. You can set things to auto-delete really quickly. People just like using Signal for those reasons. You see a lot of journalists on their social media say DM for Signal. It's like something you can, there's a little distance, I guess, from personal text messages. It doesn't show up in your personal iMessage thread. So it's very popular in DC. You can understand why, a bunch of journalists would put each other in a thread, although I don't know if that ever happening, but you could understand why a bunch of journalists or think tank workers or, politicians talking about healthcare, something that's not related to national security, would toss themselves into a signal message. But when you're working for the government, even those politicians, hypothetically, that there are record laws. When the information is about national security, that there are very, very strict laws about where you can share this types of information. So for everybody to just roll into this is not just bizarre, it's also a huge scandal, obviously, for anybody who was participating in this over Signal. Now, if the NSA invites you to a Signal chat, you may reasonably assume that he has figured out some type of way that this is appropriate. Then again, if you're Tulsi Gabbard, DNI, and you also do significant intelligence work, or you're the chief of staff at the White House, like Susie Wiles, or you're Steve Witkoff, who's currently negotiating ceasefires, you would also probably think twice before engaging like this over a phone app, or Pete Hegseth. Pete Hegseth is proactively sending information here. So it is incredibly convenient for these guys to be able to talk and share this information in real time and to have these debates in real time. But it's a serious problem for Waltz and for Hegseth, who appears to have sent sensitive information here as well. And if, let's say, there are personal inner administration conflicts with, for example, Waltz and someone else, this is the type of thing that gets you sort of pushed out. It makes you less popular. People are now going to suspect that he had Jeffrey Goldberg in his phone, because when you go to add someone in contacts, it comes from, add someone into a Signal chat, it comes from your contacts. So now they'll suspect that he was potentially serving as a source for someone like Jeffrey Goldberg, who is very hostile to Trump and the Trump administration. What Goldberg says here is he did not assume that the request was from the actual Michael Waltz. I have met him in the past, and though I didn't find it particularly strange that he might be reaching out to me, I did think it somewhat unusual given the Trump administration's contentious relationship with journalists and Trump's periodic fixation on me specifically. So if people are suspicious that Waltz has Goldberg in his contacts, they now have good reason to be suspicious. So Goldberg plays it cool, like they don't really know each other, but it sounds like it's probable that Waltz had Goldberg's phone number. And that could be for any number of reasons. That could be because he called him to get a correction on a story and called him to say that Suckers and Losers story was BS, or called him to try to shed light on something that was incorrect in the Atlantic or something he said on TV. There could be totally legitimate reasons, but if people are going knives out for Mike Waltz for policy reasons, say they disagree with the strikes, say they think he is a little too cozy with the Pentagon top brass, whatever it is, this is the type of thing that gets you pushed out more easily. It's used as a cloud, right? Like there's a cloud that hangs over you and can be used against you by your enemies. So really tough for Mike Waltz, probably will be tough for Pete Hegseth. They're going to have fairly easy answers to it, but they've probably damaged themselves internally a bit, especially Waltz, because this just seems like, not on a partisan basis, this just seems like a really, really obviously dumb thing to do, and it seems careless and reckless. So that damaged brand internally, it can be hard to climb back from those things. I mean, if you're really good at managing interpersonal relationships and you totally take a mea culpa, you say, my bad, won't happen again, sometimes you can climb out of this, and sometimes the opposition goes so insane in its attacks on you that you're able to use that too as a way to kind of climb back out of the hole, because it looks like all of the forces that are aligned against everyone else are aligned against you. So maybe Waltz will have something like that in his future, but this could just damage his standing in MAGA world. It will damage his standing in MAGA world. The Jameson Greer theory, I have no idea if it's right. You could understand why USTR would be added here. Maybe that's the explanation we'll end up getting. But it looks bad for everybody. Everybody should have been questioning why this information was being shared on Signal. They shouldn't have been, posting emojis. They should have been, contacting Waltz privately to say we should take this to a SCIF, or we should find out another system to communicate on that isn't Signal, because on Signal it's really easy for you to accidentally add Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic to the chat. So, are there a lot of policy ideological implications of this? No, it could have been really bad. Everyone has dealt with their own scandals of being reckless with classified information. It's bad if you're being reckless with classified information, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. It can genuinely put people in danger. I actually would imagine that Mike Waltz would be horrified by the idea of the Signal chat being infiltrated. He probably thought there's no way that it could have been because he was putting it together and running it with Pete Hegseth. That probably just seems unthinkable. But it's obviously reckless because Jeffrey Goldberg was added to the chat. So this is a crazy story. I'm sure it will be blown out of proportion, but it's absolutely insane. No matter, where the left tries to take it, it is a crazy story. It will damage Mike Waltz internally in the administration, but we'll see where it goes from here. Maybe he can climb back out of the hole. But thanks for watching. Thanks for working through this insane Atlantic story. Appreciate it. We'll see where it goes. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you download your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. You get paywalled episodes, an email address to communicate with us directly, and a weekly newsletter from me. I write it myself. We'll see you back here soon with more.